Last week I started a series about young Earth creationism. The purpose of this series is to show how real science actually proves the Bible is 100% correct about where we come from, and also that Darwinism, or the theory of evolution, is scientifically impossible. I explained what the word evolution means and how many different types of evolution would be necessary for Darwinism to be true. This series will eventually cover a whole bunch of different topics, some having a direct connection to Darwinism and some with an indirect connection. It's very difficult trying to decide in what order to present this information. People want to hear your best evidence first, right? Well, my best evidence would probably go over your heads if I presented it at first, because it's pretty technical. And if I presented it by itself, it would be very easy for people to just refuse to believe it. You need to hear all the evidence cumulatively. Last week, the only evidence I presented was about the Urey-Miller experiment and how it proved that life could not have started randomly on its own. Sadly, the militant atheists of the world refuse to believe that because they don't want to believe in a God that they'd have to answer to and follow his rules. They claim that other experiments have proven that life can arise from non-life. But think about this. Every single experiment they're talking about was a controlled experiment in a laboratory performed by an intelligent team of humans. It wasn't like a new life form suddenly arose without any human help in a test tube. No, it took intelligence to force some chemicals to produce something that they call the building blocks of life, which, by the way, is not even close to actually creating life from non-life. They just created a small percentage of something that then they assume could become life. It's 100% wishful thinking. Now that's just half of their argument. The worst argument is their claim that how life started has nothing to do with Darwinism in the first place. They want to claim that all Darwinism really is how the animals changed from one kind of animal to another kind of animal. You know, how cows supposedly turned into whales and how dinosaurs supposedly turned into birds. All they want to do is argue that all those little changes eventually turn an animal into something completely different, if you give it enough time. And that's another subject that I'll cover later on, Darwinism's belief in billions of years. So they want to ignore all the stuff that came before Darwinism and only focus on animals changing into other animals. Forget how time, space, and matter came into existence to begin with. Forget where all the elements came from. Forget how the first stars formed themselves out of only hydrogen. And of course, forget about life starting from non-life. Just assume all those things happened somehow, and then look at the supposed evidence that animals turned into other animals. That's how backwards these people think. They put the cart before the horse. But Darwinism isn't built on honesty. Let me tell you some of the various things that has been used as supposed evidence for Darwinism that has since been proven to be fraudulent. Some of them were frauds right from the beginning, but others were things that were disproven later on, but they stayed in the textbooks for decades after they were disproven. That is still fraud. I don't want to get into the politics of Darwinism now, but it's very true that there are people in this world who purposely push Darwinism in our schools for very nefarious reasons. One of the first things you might think of when it comes to Darwinism is the famous diagram of an ape turning into a human. But what they don't teach you in school is that every single one of the famous cavemen, like Nebraska Man or Piltdown Man or Neanderthal Man or Cro-Magnon Man or Lucy, have all been proven as either frauds or just humans like us today. None of the cavemen show any evidence of apes turning into humans. Another thing they claim is evidence for Darwinism is the supposed existence of vestigial organs. They claim that these body parts, such as the appendix, are no longer needed by modern humans and have no use in our bodies. They are supposedly just leftover organs from our evolutionary days millions of years ago. But what they don't tell you is that every supposed vestigial organ has actually been found to have a use and is very much needed. The appendix is part of the immune system, especially in children. I know that from experience. I had my appendix taken out when I was a little kid, and I soon ended up with cancer and had to go through a year and a half of chemotherapy. Don't tell me the appendix is vestigial. There is no such thing as a vestigial organ. One of the more famous examples in the textbooks is a story about the peppered moth. They show a picture of a white peppered moth and claim that it survived on white tree trunks because the birds couldn't see them. Then the trees turned black because of local industry, and the moth evolved into a black moth to survive. They use this example to show how an animal can supposedly adapt to its changing environment to survive. And this is supposedly evidence that animals can change into other animals? There's so much wrong with this peppered moth story. First of all, the example itself would only be an example of microevolution, not macroevolution. It's still a moth. It only changed color. Secondly, animals can't decide to evolve. They didn't choose to have black offspring so they could survive. They didn't change color, they only changed which color survived, as the tree trunks changed color. But here's the real kicker. The entire example was a fraud. It never happened to begin with. They glued the moths to the tree to take pictures for the textbooks and made up the story. It turns out that actual science proves that those moths don't rest on tree trunks during the day at all. Are you starting to get the picture? Dishonesty is a huge part of the teachings of Darwinism. Remember the pictures of different kinds of horses that supposedly evolved into each other? Again, this would only be microevolution if it were true. But again, it's another fraud. There are a lot of differences between those horses that prove that they couldn't have evolved into each other. But wait, there's more. In the 1800s, after Darwin's book came out, there was a guy named Ernst Haeckel who desperately wanted to help Darwin prove his theory to be true. He concocted a complete fraud that goes by the name ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. It was taught in the textbooks for decades, and even now can still be found in some textbooks. But the whole thing is a complete fraud and has absolutely no truth to it at all. Now, there's plenty of other dishonest things, and I'll cover them later on when we get to another topic. But now, let's look into Darwinism itself. Let's look into macroevolution. Is it possible that an organism can somehow mutate its offspring into a different kind of organism with new features that the parents didn't have? Can a dinosaur somehow give birth to a dinosaur that now has feathers for the first time? Can a cow give birth to a calf that now has a blowhole on its head so it can swim like a whale? Don't these ideas sound totally ridiculous? But this is what Darwinism actually teaches. And the only thing that makes it believable is by giving it millions of years of time to make it seem possible. They claim that the way it works is through mutations. They claim that something mutates and changes a little bit, and that little change somehow becomes beneficial, an advantage, a better feature that the animal didn't previously have. But of course, it's not like animals just mutates an entire set of wings all at once. they know that would be ridiculous. So they have to claim that over millions of years, tiny little changes eventually turned into a fully functioning set of wings. Millions of years worth of tiny little changes eventually gave us the eyeball. The problem with this is that it's not observable science. They have to claim that it took millions of years for this to happen. Nobody can prove that in a lab. This is the difference between what's called empirical science and historical science. Empirical science can be tested in a lab. Historical science is basically just guessing what happened long ago. You will eventually see that all of the supposed evidence for Darwinism is either historical science, bad interpretations of empirical science, or outright frauds. So where did the wing or eyeball come from? Is it really possible for millions of years worth of mutations to produce an eyeball? Not even close. This is called irreducible complexity. The eyeball has many different parts to it. If one thing isn't there, the whole thing doesn't work. The entire eyeball has to evolve all at the same time, or it couldn't evolve at all. If an animal has parts of eyes that don't work yet, it ain't gonna live long enough to evolve the rest of the parts. You see, the human eye had to have been designed, not evolved. When you see an unnatural pattern, you have to assume somebody created that pattern. If you found a painting in the woods, would you think it just happened by the weather? Of course not. Design demands a designer. When you really look into how the human body operates, you will see incredible design to it. All life is programmed by something called DNA. It's super small inside of each one of our cells, but it controls everything about us. You see, Darwin back in the 1800s thought that a single cell was just a blob of jelly. He had no idea what empirical science later found out about the simple cell. It turns out that a cell is more complex than a NASA space shuttle. Just because it's super small doesn't mean it's simple. Now, how does a simple cell, which is more complex than a space shuttle, just evolve into being? It doesn't. Now that we've been studying DNA for many decades, it's now very evident that the incredible amount of information that's found inside our DNA couldn't have just happened by random evolutionary chance. Somebody programmed Microsoft Word and Excel and PowerPoint. These programs didn't just program themselves. DNA is the same way. It had to have been programmed by someone. So, could macroevolution happen because of mutations? Nope. The only place it ever happens because of mutations is in the textbooks or the comic books.